The air was thick with smoke, a suffocating haze that wrapped around the night like a deadly shroud. Flames roared, devouring the modest house in a relentless blaze, their orange glow casting eerie shadows across the frightened faces of onlookers. A mother stood frozen at the curb, her screams drowned out by the crackling fire. Firefighters were still minutes away, but time was slipping away too fast. Someone was still inside. Then, from the chaos, a blur of movement. A lone dog, its fur slick with soot, bolted toward the inferno. Gasps erupted from the crowd as the animal darted past the burning threshold, disappearing into the darkness. No one could believe it. No one could stop it. Seconds stretched into agonizing minutes. The house groaned under the heat, its structure on the verge of collapse. The mother trembled, clutching her chest, tears streaking down her ash-covered face. Would the dog ever make it back out? And if it did, what would it bring with it? And then it happened. A shape emerged from the smoke. The dog, struggling under the weight of something, staggered toward the exit. But what it carried in its jaws sent a shockwave through the crowd. What was so important that this brave creature risked its life? And how did this one moment change everything? What happened next? No one could have expected. The night air was suffocating, thick with the acrid scent of burning wood and melting plastic. The once cozy home, now an inferno, crackled and groaned as flames licked hungrily at its walls. Embers floated skyward like fireflies, only to be lost in the swirling black smoke. A deep, unsettling glow pulsed from within, casting long, distorted shadows against the pavement where neighbors stood, their faces twisted in horror. Each second dragged on like an eternity. The sirens in the distance were still too far away, their wailing a cruel reminder that help hadn't yet arrived. The mother's breaths came in ragged gasps, her trembling hands clutching the front of her shirt as she searched the flames for any sign, any hope. The dog had vanished inside. A neighbor, an older man with soot-streaked cheeks, shook his head. No way it's coming back out. His voice was grim, almost apologetic. That place is coming down any second. A younger woman beside him pressed a hand over her mouth, her wide eyes reflecting the flames. But why did it go in? No one had an answer. The mother stood frozen, her nails digging into her palms, her heart pounding so violently it drowned out the roar of the fire. She wanted to move, to scream, to do something, but terror had locked her in place. Inside the house, the dog weaved through smoke-filled corridors, its instincts battling the suffocating heat. The walls trembled, pieces of the ceiling crumbling as the fire tightened its grip. It didn't hesitate, couldn't. There was something it needed to find, something more important than its own safety. And out there, on the street, no one knew what would happen next. Would the dog emerge? Or had it made the ultimate sacrifice? The tension in the air was suffocating. The crowd held its breath, waiting, watching, fearing the worst. Then a flicker of movement in the flames. Something was coming. The air was thick with panic, but for Sarah Dawson, time had nearly stopped. Every sound, every scream, every crackle of fire faded into the background as she stared at the flames consuming her home. The fire painted the night in violent shades of orange and red, but she could only see the door her dog had disappeared through. Sarah was a single mother in her early 30s, strong-willed and independent, but in this moment, she felt powerless. Her son, Ethan, only 6 years old, clung to her leg, his tiny hands fisting the fabric of her jeans. His face was streaked with soot and tears. "Mommy, Max is still inside," he whimpered, his voice barely audible over the roaring inferno. Max, the loyal golden retriever who had been by their side through everything. The thought of losing him tightened around Sarah's chest like a vice. Max wasn't just a pet. He was family. When Ethan's father had walked out 2 years ago, it had been Max who stayed. He had slept beside Ethan every night, his warmth a silent promise that no matter what, he would always be there. Tears blurred Sarah's vision. "I know, baby. I know." She wanted to tell him Max would be okay, but the words caught in her throat. A firefighter, his uniform streaked with ash, placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Ma'am, I know this is hard, but you need to step back. The structure is unstable. His voice was steady, but his eyes held something else. Concern. Maybe even pity. He didn't expect Max to make it out. Neither did the neighbors who had gathered, watching in horrified silence. Among them was Tom, the elderly man from next door, his cane shaking as he leaned forward, straining to see through the flames. That dog's got more heart than most people I know, he muttered, shaking his head. Beside him, Maria, a mother of 3, wrapped her arms around herself. But why did he go back in? That was the question gnawing at everyone. The fire had started unexpectedly, spreading too fast for Sarah to grab anything before she and Ethan had escaped. She had been sure Max had followed them. So why had he run back? Inside, Max's world was a nightmare of heat and smoke. His lungs burned, but he pushed forward, weaving past fallen debris. He wasn't looking for a way out. He was looking for something else, something he had to protect. Sarah could still remember the day Max had come into their lives. Ethan had been 4, struggling with nightmares after his father left. She had taken him to the shelter, thinking a pet might help. The moment they had met Max, it had been instant love. He had placed his big golden paw on Ethan's lap and licked his tears away. Now, that same dog was risking everything. Sarah's hands trembled as she wiped her face, but the tears kept coming. He went back in for something, she whispered. Tom nodded grimly. That dog knows something we don't. Sarah turned her eyes back to the flames. The fire roared like a beast, and every second felt like an eternity. The firefighter standing beside her lifted his radio. No signs of movement. If the dog doesn't come out in the next 60 seconds, we're gonna have to assume. A sudden gasp rippled through the crowd. There, someone shouted. Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs as she followed their gaze. A shadow against the flames, darting through the broken doorway. Max. But he wasn't alone. The air was thick with smoke, turning the night into a suffocating haze of burning embers and destruction. Flames raged violently, devouring the house with terrifying speed. The distant wail of sirens echoed through the streets, but even as firefighters rushed to the scene, it was clear. There was little they could do to save the home. Sarah clutched Ethan's hand, her nails digging into her palm. The fire had spread too fast, too aggressively. Their home, their memories, their lives. Everything was turning to ash right before their eyes. And then Ethan screamed, "Max!" Sarah spun around just in time to see their golden retriever dart toward the inferno. "No!" she cried, her voice raw with fear. "Max, come back!" But the dog was gone, disappearing into the sea of flames. Ethan sobbed, pulling against Sarah's grip. "Mom," he went inside. "We have to go after him." Sarah's entire body shook. Every instinct told her to run after him, to do something, anything to get him back. But the flames were too strong. The front of the house had already collapsed, blocking the entrance. "He's smart," she whispered, trying to convince herself as much as her son. "He'll find a way out." The firefighters had just arrived, their leader shouting orders as they pulled hoses from the trucks. One of them, a tall man with soot-streaked skin, grabbed Sarah's shoulders. "Ma'am, is anyone still inside?" "My dog," she gasped. He ran in. The firefighter's face darkened. "It's too dangerous." A sudden loud crash cut through the chaos. The roof caved in, sending a shower of sparks into the sky. Sarah felt her knees give out. No, Max was in there. Ethan broke free from her grasp, running toward the house before she could stop him. "Max!" He screamed into the smoke. "Please, come back." And then movement. A shadow. A flash of gold against the blackness. Max. He was limping, his fur scorched and dirty, but he was coming. And in his mouth, something small, something moving. Kitten. Sarah's heart stopped. Max wasn't running for himself. He was running to save another life. The fire roared behind him, closing in fast. The heat was unbearable, the smoke blinding. But Max kept going, his legs trembling with every step. "Come on, buddy," one of the firefighters called out, stepping closer with a blanket. "You can make it." Max stumbled. His legs buckled. For a horrifying second, Sarah thought he wouldn't make it. But then one final push. One last surge of strength. Max burst through the smoke, collapsing onto the grass just as the last of the house caved in behind him. The crowd erupted into cheers. Ethan dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around Max. "You did it," he sobbed. "You saved her." Sarah knelt beside them, stroking Max's soot-covered fur. "You're incredible," she whispered. The kitten, small and fragile, let out a soft meow. A firefighter crouched down, checking them over. "They're both alive," he said, smiling. "This dog is a hero." Sarah wiped away her tears, holding Ethan close. They had lost their home. But in that moment it didn't matter, because Max had reminded them of something far more important. Family isn't about walls or belongings. It's about love, about courage, about sacrifice. And Max had proven that tonight. As she looked at the dog who had risked everything, Sarah knew, no matter what lay ahead, they would be okay, because they still had each other. The chaos had settled. The fire was still being tamed, but the worst had passed. Ash floated in the air like dying embers, the last remains of the home they once knew. Sarah sat on the cold pavement, her arms wrapped tightly around Ethan. Max lay beside them, exhausted but alive, the tiny kitten curled against his side. But something still didn't feel right. Sarah couldn't shake the unease creeping up her spine. Maybe it was the adrenaline fading, or maybe it was the way Max kept looking at the wreckage, as if something was still inside. The firefighters worked efficiently, dousing the final flames, while neighbors murmured in hushed voices. Some came forward to offer blankets and water, but Sarah barely heard them. Her ears rang with the echoes of the fire, the sharp cracks of wood breaking, the distant cries of fear. Then Max growled. Sarah stiffened. He hadn't made a sound since escaping the fire, but now his ears were flat against his head, his body tense. "Max," she whispered. The dog's eyes stayed locked on the smoldering remains of the house. His body trembled, but it wasn't from pain. It was something else, something deeper. Ethan noticed it too. "Nom, what's wrong with him?" Before she could answer, Max let out a sharp bark. Not a panicked one, not one of fear, a warning. The firefighter who had helped them earlier turned toward the wreckage. "Something still in there?" Sarah shook her head. "No, there couldn't be. Could there?" One of the other firefighters walked toward the house, stepping carefully over the charred wood and fallen beams. "We did a full sweep before the collapse. No one was inside, but Max didn't believe that. He barked again, his tail rigid, his body pushing forward. The kitten stirred in response, letting out a weak mew. Sarah's pulse quickened. Is it possible something was hidden? The firefighter hesitated. Not likely, but a loud crack cut through the air. Everyone froze. The wreckage shifted slightly, a piece of the burnt ceiling tilting forward before settling again. Then another sound. Not the fire, not the wind. Something scratching. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Max lunged forward, barking furiously now, dragging his tired body closer to the ruins. The firefighter turned back to his team. "We need to check that out." The next few seconds stretched endlessly. Two men carefully approached the collapsed structure, using long poles to shift debris without disturbing anything unstable. The crowd held their breath, watching, waiting. Then movement. A small, shivering shape emerged from beneath a half-burned wooden beam. Another kitten. But this one was different. It was frail, covered in soot, its fur barely visible beneath the dirt and ash. But something else caught Sarah's eye. Collar. She felt a jolt of confusion. Who would put a collar on a kitten this small? The firefighter scooped it up carefully, cradling it in his gloved hands. Looks like it was hiding under the floorboards. Must have gotten stuck when the fire spread. Max whimpered, nudging forward, his eyes locked onto the kitten. Sarah leaned in, her heart pounding. The collar was old, worn, but there was a name tag hanging from it. The firefighter gently wiped away the soot, revealing the inscription underneath. And when Sarah saw the name, her blood ran cold. because she knew that name. She knew it all too well. It was the name of their old cat. The one that had died. The one that had been buried in their backyard 2 years ago. Sarah's mind raced, her vision blurring. She had put that tag on with her own hands. She had mourned the loss. And yet, here it was, dangling from the neck of a kitten that shouldn't exist. Ethan gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Mom, that's Luna's tag." Sarah looked at Max, the dog who had risked his life for these animals. He was still staring at the kitten, his body trembling. And then something even stranger happened. The kitten looked back. Not in fear, not in confusion, but with recognition, like it had known them all along. The air felt different, heavier. The night was silent, but not in a peaceful way. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. What had Max really brought out of that fire? And why did it feel like their past had just come crawling back from the ashes? The night pressed in around them, thick with the scent of wet ash and the distant crackling of dying embers. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears as she stared at the soot-covered kitten nestled in the firefighter's gloved hands. The name on the tag gleamed faintly in the firelight. Luna. Her Luna. The cat she had buried 2 years ago. A suffocating silence fell over the scene. Even the murmuring neighbors seemed frozen, sensing something was off but not quite understanding what. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps as a cold chill snaked down her spine. Max let out a soft whimper, his body low to the ground, ears flattened. His usual fierce, protective stance had shifted. This wasn't the reaction of a dog who had just saved a helpless animal. This was fear. Ethan clutched at Sarah's sleeve. "Mom," his voice was barely above a whisper. "How is this possible?" Sarah couldn't answer. Her mind raced, trying to rationalize, to explain. Maybe someone else in the neighborhood had a cat that looked like Luna. Maybe the tag had somehow been lost and found again. But deep down, she knew better. The firefighter holding the kitten glanced between Sarah and Ethan, sensing their distress. "Do you recognize this cat?" Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came out. Instead, she stepped forward, hesitantly reaching for the tiny creature. The moment her fingers brushed its fur, a shock of icy dread rushed through her veins. The kitten's body was warm, but something about it felt wrong. Then, it lifted its head and looked directly into her eyes. Sarah's heart stopped. His gaze was too familiar. The deep green eyes, the knowing expression, the slight tilt of the head. It wasn't just a kitten. It knew her, and suddenly memories came rushing back. Luna had been more than just a pet. She had always seemed different, too intelligent, too perceptive. She had disappeared one day, only to return a week later, watching them with a strange intensity. Sarah had brushed it off, chalking it up to her imagination. And then she had died, or at least Sarah had thought she had. Her hands trembled as she cradled the kitten, her mind battling between logic and the gnawing, impossible truth. Ethan's grip on her sleeve tightened. "Mom, look at Mac." Sarah turned. Max hadn't moved. His body was rigid, his eyes locked onto the kitten, his chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven breaths. Then he growled, a deep guttural sound, one she had never heard from him before. The kitten let out a tiny, almost amused chirp, and Max lunged. The moment was a blur of movement and sound. Barking, gasps from the onlookers, Sarah's sharp cry as she instinctively pulled back. But the instant before Max could reach the kitten, a powerful gust of wind tore through the wreckage. The embers flared back to life, a sudden burst of flames leaping up in the ruins of their home. Gasps and shouts erupted from the crowd. The firefighters moved into action, trying to contain the flare-up, but Sarah barely noticed, because the kitten was gone, vanished. She hadn't let go of it. She knew she hadn't, but her arms were empty, the weight of the small body suddenly absent. And then Max stopped growling. Sarah turned, her breath catching in her throat. He stood there, ears pricked, his head tilting slightly. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he wagged his tail once and turned away from the ruins. The tension snapped. The eerie stillness lifted. It was as if a heavy weight had been pulled off the air, like an unseen presence had finally left. Ethan exhaled shakily. What just happened? Sarah didn't have an answer, but deep inside she knew. Something had been in that house. Something that wasn't supposed to come back. And Max had stopped it. Days passed. The remains of their home were cleared, leaving nothing but scorched earth and memories. Insurance covered the losses, and neighbors offered their support. But some things couldn't be replaced. Sarah sat on the back porch of their temporary rental, watching Max nap in the afternoon sun. He was calm now. Peace. Ethan sat beside her, absently flipping the old tag between his fingers. The one that had belonged to Luna. The one Sarah had found resting on the doorstep that morning. There was no kitten, no trace of fur, just the tag. Ethan hesitated. Mom, do you think Luna really came back? Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out and ran her fingers through Max's fur. He stirred slightly, letting out a deep sigh of contentment. Whatever had happened that night, whatever had come crawling out of the fire, was gone now. And thanks to Max, it wasn't coming back. Sarah took a deep breath, then smiled softly at her son. I think some things, she said carefully, are better left behind. The nights were quieter now. Sarah still found herself waking up sometimes, expecting to hear the soft padding of tiny paws against the wooden floor, a faint purring at the foot of her bed. But the house remained still, the only sound being Max's steady breathing beside her. It had been weeks since the fire, weeks since that night, and yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Within her, within Max, within everything. Ethan had stopped asking about Luna. He still carried the old tag in his pocket, a silent reminder of the strange, unexplainable events they had witnessed. But he didn't push for answers. Maybe, deep down, he understood what Sarah did. Some mysteries were never meant to be solved. Max, on the other hand, had gone back to being his usual playful, protective self. But there were moments, quiet, fleeting moments, where he would stop and stare at the front door, ears twitching, as if waiting for what Sarah didn't know. Or maybe she did. Sitting on the back porch one evening, she watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of fire and gold. She let out a slow breath, the cool air filling her lungs. What had really happened that night? Had Max truly sensed something lurking in that house? Had Luna really returned from beyond? Or had it been something else, something darker, something pretending? Sarah knew she would never have the answers. And maybe that was okay. Because in the end, what mattered wasn't what they had seen, or what they couldn't explain. What mattered was that Max had protected them. What mattered was that some doors had been shut forever. And sometimes that was the only kind of closure a person really needed. As she reached down to scratch behind Max's ears, he let out a small, content sigh, leaning into her touch. The past had tried to claw its way back. But thanks to him, it had failed. Sarah smiled softly, staring out into the fading light. Some stories don't need an ending. Some stories just fade into the dark. And maybe, just maybe, that's where they belong. If this story gave you chills or left you thinking about the mysteries of the unknown, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more spine-tingling tales. Your support helps us keep bringing you the most gripping and eerie stories. What do you think really happened that night? Was Max guided by something beyond this world? Or was it just pure instinct? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your theories. And if you enjoy stories that send shivers down your spine, make sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. We have even more mysteries, hauntings, and unbelievable true stories coming your way soon. Stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, some things are better left in the dark. See you in the next video.